Thanks for tuning in to the Financial Empowerment Charlas created by Nationwide in partnership with the Hispanic Heritage Foundation to help in your journey towards financial wellness. I'm Karen Vergara, fiduciary financial advisor, and today we'll be discussing money traps and how they can negatively affect our financial freedom. I'm excited to have two friends and colleagues joining me, Paul Roldan, certified financial planner. Hi, Paul.
Hey, Karen.
And Vivi Schenk, financial freedom strategist. Hi, Vivi.
Hi, Karen.
So let's dive into this concept of money traps. Paul, let's just start with what is a money trap and where do we learn them from?
You know, a money trap is any idea, any thought, any pursuit that hurts you financially, but seems like a great deal initially. Okay, so it may bring immediate pleasure or promise long-term benefits, but it ultimately traps you. Okay, it's that gotcha. So normally people don't just jump into a money trap willingly, knowing it's going to be, sabotaging their financial future, but it's something that could hurt them in the future. So, if we know this, the challenge is, where do these traps come from? Because as I mentioned, it's not that you know that they're a trap, but the challenge for us as a people is that typically we're exposed to these traps via our family and our friends. Okay, especially we as a people, Latinos, we trust our family, somos gente de familia. And so my dad said, my tío said, my prima said, this was great and all that type of stuff. That's wonderful, except sometimes they don't know any better. Okay, so we end up pursuing something that doesn't make any sense. And then once we realize it, it's too late. So it's funny, as a financial advisor, the number one financial advisor in the country is usually your coworker at the water cooler.
Right.
And yet, maybe they shouldn't be your financial advisor because they're in the same position you are. You want to get people who are, who can mentor you, who are where you want to be. So your friends and family tend to be a source of money traps. The media. Remember, the media feeds on emotion, on frenzy, okay? And it's great to be informed, but at the same time, you've got to be careful. I hear announcements on the radio all day long, hey, buy this or invest in this. And those radio announcers aren't doing it because they're doing it or because they are experienced financial people. It's because that's what their sponsors paying them to say. So we have to be careful what we believe in the media as far as finances are concerned. So friends, family, and media are typically our main teachers in personal finance, sadly, because they don't have this in schools to actually teach us good personal finance courses.
Right. So now we understand what money traps are and then the sources where they come from. So I'd like for us to dive in deeper and explore some of the money traps that we can encounter. Let's start with something that I know many viewers and listeners have in their wallets, and that is credit cards. So Vivi, how are credit cards money traps? Because I thought that you needed credit cards. I thought they were necessary to help us build our credit.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, we first need to understand, what does a credit score measure? So a credit score measures our ability to acquire and pay off debt. So it doesn't measure our wealth. It doesn't measure how good we're doing in our personal finances. Like, we could have a lot of money saved in the bank, right? And have a mediocre credit score. Just as an example, right? You could do well, which is actually what happened to me recently. I did not have a credit score because I hadn't taken out a credit card myself, but we've been moving forward and building our net worth. Wow. So net worth is what actually measures your wealth. So yes, a credit score, it measures something, but what it actually measures is your ability to acquire and pay off debt. So with that in mind, credit cards can be a money trap because they work with they usually have the highest interest rates when we're talking about loans and debts. They have the highest ones in the market, usually, correct me if I'm wrong. And another thing is that they work with an interest that is called compound interest. So this kind of interest, it can grow exponentially if you're not careful and if you're not taking care of it, which is actually what happened to me. I used to, like I shared in our previous podcast, I used to swipe my credit card, and I would only just pay the minimums. And what happened is that I eventually maxed out all of my credit cards. The interest was so high that even though I paid the minimums, I paid the balance, well, not the balance, but the minimums every single month, the debt looked the same. And I think it was even continuing to grow to the point that I got into collections. And it was really a traumatizing experience, which I don't recommend to anyone. So this is how a credit card can unknowingly become a money trap.
Yeah, so that's the credit cards again. We have to be very careful with those. And let's talk about another money trap. And it's an all too common practice to buy a car and finance it. And so, Paul, what are some of the misconceptions around financing a car, and why is financing a car also considered a money trap?
This is interesting. And if you haven't listened to our first episode, I invite you to listen to that, where, Karen shared the story of her husband who was so eager to buy a new Camaro when he came to this country, and the reasons behind that. Okay. I'm not saying there were bad reasons. Okay. However, as we mentioned in episodes, those reasons lead us to make certain decisions. And that leads into this conversation, which is falling into some money traps. Okay. And one of them is with buying cars. Cars is a tough one because, the average American buys about eight to nine cars in their lifetime. Okay. Wow. So when I heard that number, it blew me away. Okay. So here's a challenge with a car, because a car is a depreciating asset. What does that mean? It means the moment you buy it, it's losing value. Okay. Right. And if you buy a brand new car, el carro del año, it usually loses 20 to 30% in the first year in value. Okay. So notice how that alone goes against every principle that's out there as far as building wealth, because your goal in building wealth and financial wealth is actually grow your finances and minimize things that decrease in value. So the more you turn over cars, you buy more cars, the more you keep throwing money at stuff that keeps losing value. Okay, especially when they're brand new. So here's the challenge that we have, because yes, there's all kinds of arguments. Well, you want a reliable car, yes, but it doesn't have to be brand new. If you have a brand new car, you're throwing 20 to 30% of value out the window, and then subsequently about 15% on average a year after that. Okay, so there's the depreciation factor, and then there's a financing factor. So now if you borrow money to buy a car, you're paying interest, okay, however little it be. Oh, but I only got a 1.2% loan. It's still interest, okay, right, on something that's losing value. Okay, so that's a bad combination. Okay, and then lastly, it's understanding that whenever you have a payment for anything, it's hurting your cash flow. So what does that mean? If I've got a $300-400 a month payment, that means a piece of every monthly paycheck is being committed to give it away to somebody else. Okay, these are all three negative elements when it comes to building wealth. And we see it so prominent because cars are something that we do over and over again. And between housing and cars are probably and credit cards are probably three of the biggest money traps out there.
Yeah. So you mentioned housing. And so let's talk about that. We can see credit cards, we can see cars, how they can get us into trouble, but owning a home is part of the quintessential American dream. So how can it be that a home can get you into trouble? And I think we need to consider some of the factors that really we should be taking into account when purchasing a home. So Vivi, what are some things that we need to think about when we're building our American dream? Right.
So because it is this dream, right? Sometimes we idealize home ownership, right? And we want the perfect home because it's finally our home. I'm not going to be renting anymore. So we want to get this perfect home. But unfortunately, sometimes we can fall into buying a house that is too expensive for us. And we end up basically, being house poor. So we are having to, eat rice and beans and see where.
I love rice and beans.
I know, me too. That wouldn't be a sacrifice for me.
That's true. So we end up, eating something. You just have to save money, right? That's true, because I love rice and beans too. But for my husband, he's like, he does not want to live in rice and beans. But I think you get the idea, right? We have to save extra just so we can pay our house and our housing expenses. Why? Because we got a house that is just too expensive for us. We just you can't afford it. So a good rule of thumb is that you shouldn't spend more than 28% of your gross monthly income in home-related costs.
Oh, that's a really nice kind of ratio so we can take a look and say, okay, if this is going over 28%, maybe I need to consider the cost of my home and I don't want to be house poor. So
exactly.
What's another factor that we should take into account when we're buying a home, Paul? What about the 30-year versus the 15-year mortgages? What are the differences?
Yeah, that's a great question because, in this country, most institutions sell you the 30-year mortgage when you go buy a home. Okay. That's what is almost all the time presented. Why? Because the 30-year mortgage stretches out the length of time that you're able to make payments on that house, which means your monthly payments are lower. Okay. But that's great because it makes the house seem more affordable. Okay. The challenge is with that. Challenge is that the longer you're paying that, the longer you're paying interest. Okay. So that means you're going to pay more interest for the house. So sadly, typically speaking, when you buy a house on a 30-year and it takes you 30 years to pay it off, you almost pay twice as much for that house, depending on your interest rate. Okay. Than when you initially paid into it. And here's this. Yes, owning a home could be a blessing. Okay. It could be great. Okay. Especially once you pay it off and you don't have that mortgage anymore. The challenge is, as Vivi mentioned, if we don't do some proper calculating to make sure that we don't commit too much of our paycheck, okay, on a monthly basis, we're going to be strapped financially. So ideally, what you want to do, again, interest is not a good thing. You don't want to be paying interest. This is, Vivi had mentioned credit cards. That's how they make all their money. Well, mortgages, banks, and lending institutions make their money on the interest. So a 15-year can substantially cut your interest payments over time that you're going to pay in a house, making it more viable for you to actually take money and invest somewhere else and actually grow. It's tougher because it means you might not be able to buy as big of a house, okay? But it's really, when you measure that, it's really what you should be and what you can afford if you want to be building wealth and not keep yourself strapped and being house poor.
That's a great point, Paul. I'd like to talk about emergency funds. How important is to have an emergency fund when you're buying a home, Vivi?
It's extremely important. So my husband and I, we just bought a property. And we were not used to the type of expenses that a house calls for. We heard of it, but we were like, it's going to be okay, right? But what happened is that recently our AC, for example, it broke down and we had to replace the whole thing, right? So it costed us like $4,000. But since obviously, we're learning about these things, personal finances, we did have an emergency fund. But I can't imagine, and I understand building an emergency fund before you buy a house is just like, I'm trying to save for my down payment. On top of that, you want me to save for an emergency fund? Yes, we want you to save for an emergency fund. Because if we did not have that savings with us, I'm not sure what we would have done. We probably would have incurred in debt, and all of the negatives that come from acquiring debt and depreciating objects, right? The AC, it depreciates in value. So I think it would have been so stressful and such a frustrating position, right? And I don't think a home, like Dave Ramsey says, and like you said, Paul, a home should be a blessing. But when we do not have this emergency fund in place before we get it, it can easily become a burden.
And Karen, I know that a lot of people out there probably thinking, but if I'm renting, I'm throwing money away.
Yeah,
that's
definitely
a big comeback that I get, in my business. I said, listen, understand this. If you actually look at what's called an amortization schedule, okay, which shows every year by year what you pay, how much is applied to principal, which is what you owe, and how much is applied to interest. In the first few years of a mortgage, especially if you have a 30-year mortgage, the bulk of it, 80 to 90%, if not more, is going towards interest. And only a little bit of it is going towards principal. Okay, so 6 to 12 to 18, 2 years that you take to build a good emergency fund and put yourself in a better position is not going to be wasteful. On the contrary, it's going to show a lot of fruit to put you in a better position to keep the house long term.
Those are some really, really great points. And so I hope that our viewers and listeners now can get an understanding of how credit cards, how buying a car or even buying a home can be money traps. But I like for us to talk about something that many of us probably have not thought about, and that's how can entrepreneurship be a money trap? And I say that because there's this idea that being your own boss is, the dream, right? That so many people have. But so how can entrepreneurship be detrimental to our financial picture? And Paul, I know that you've been an entrepreneur for more than 20 years. So please share with us, what are some things that we need to think about when we're thinking about becoming an entrepreneur?
No, it's great that you bring up that subject, because yes, entrepreneurship is powerful. And, among Latinos and Hispanics, I think like Latinas tend to be the number one entrepreneurs in this country as far as starting new businesses, which is
that's
great.
Right. Yes.
That's a great zeal. That's a great passion. We're the type that, that's part of our cultural background. If we empezamos un kiosquito aquí, to sell empanadas, that's a business, so that is powerful and that's wonderful. However, you have to do it the right way. Kind of like you finished mentioning buying a car, buying a home. Same thing with starting a business. A business is a living entity that needs to be given life to breathe. Okay. And yet I see too many people pursue the passion, the strength of our culture, which is the passion, make a decision to become a business owner, an entrepreneur based solely on the passion without doing some of the studies and analysis and preparing themselves to do so. So yeah, being a business owner has been glamorized. However, the failure rate of business owners and startups is about 80% fail in the first 3 to 5 years. And that's not because there wasn't good intentions or, desire or work ethic. It's usually because there's certain elements that haven't been in place before you start the business. So yes, it's a great thing, but if it's done, not the right way, it could be a huge money trap that can set you back many years in your financial path to financial freedom.
Yeah, that's a great point. And Vivi, I know you're also have this entrepreneurship mindset, and the way you kind of started this entrepreneurship journey, if you will, was through multi-level marketing, this network marketing. So tell us a little bit about that. How can that also be a money trap?
Yeah. So yes, the first time that I ever loved and dreamt of the idea of becoming a girl boss was through a multi-level marketing company. And honestly, I love the environment in these companies, in this industry. It's very motivational, very inspirational. But unfortunately, that's also one of the main reasons of why I got into a tough financial situation. So what happens here is that, there's different conferences, there's different trainings. And unfortunately, what they do there is that they share the results of just the 1% of the company, of the people doing this. So that's not very realistic. It's 1% of the people that have success. So they don't show you the 99%, which you probably belong to, right?
Yeah.
And it can be so emotional because they shower you, like I said, with inspiration, with motivation, and with dreams, and yes, your mind is just blown away. And that can cloud your judgment. So that's what happened to me, right? I had this idea that I'm going to be this super successful distributor, and I wasn't organized with my finances. So you need to be very, very aware and keep your emotions in check as you're building these kinds of businesses.
So when we're talking about entrepreneurship, I think it's like Paul said, it's something that Latinos really like to do, right? And I think it also stems from the fact that in Latin America, because there's a lack of job opportunities, many times you kind of are forced into entrepreneurship. So I think it's a great also value that we have as Hispanics. But are there any ways that we can mitigate the risks of entrepreneurship so that when we do become entrepreneurs, it's actually a positive way to build our wealth and it's not detrimental? Paul, what are some things that we can do to plan for a journey into entrepreneurship?
I'm going to echo one thing that Vivi said when it came to buying a house. Same thing for entrepreneurship. If you're going to start a business, you need to have enough savings. You need to have a personal emergency fund for you and or your family, because it's critical to understand that a business, as I mentioned earlier, is an entity of its own. right? So when you start a business, you need to let the business breathe, okay, and start, growing, just like any child, like any organism needs, oxygen and blood to grow. Same thing in a business. The challenge is, if you don't have an emergency fund and savings, you're going to expect to take money out of the business to live, okay, understandably, but then you're drying the business up of a resource that you might need to use to reinvest for growth of the business itself. So I think the number one place to start is to say, do I have enough in savings that if my business doesn't produce enough for 6 or 12 months, I can still be okay with my expenses day to day?
That's a very, very good point. I think you go in and you think you're going to make money right away, and that's not necessarily the case. So you want to make sure that back home, your expenses are going to be taken care of, and you, like you said, kind of give the business breathing room. Vivi, what about you? What do you think are some other things that you wish you would have known, and when you started your entrepreneurship journey?
Yeah, I think setting realistic goals. Mm-hmm. So, you're not going to be a 6-figure, 7-figure, 8-figure earner in 6 months, right? So you need to set realistic goals. And I think that partnered with the emergency fund, that can put you in a better position if you did not, you have to plan for it. So set realistic goals. And the other thing I would say is to separate your expenses, your business expenses, separate them from your personal expenses. When we're starting out, we don't really know what we're doing, and we just mix everything. We put everything in the same account, and it can become very, very confusing. And you end up not really knowing how much you're making in your business, right? You think you're making because money is coming in, but then you're not counting how much you're reinvesting, right? So if you keep things separate, it helps you keep track of these things.
Great points. Paul, any last words of wisdom when it comes to planning for entrepreneurship?
I appreciate that. Yeah, I think at the end of the day, there's all these elements, but, if you're new to entrepreneurship, I say in any endeavor in life, you should seek some guidance. You should, as I mentioned earlier, if you want to go somewhere, it's better to ask questions of those that are where you want to be, because they can help you hopefully avoid some of the mistakes that they made and get there faster, more effectively, more efficiently without, all the bruises that come along with entrepreneurship or any new endeavor. So seek guidance, have a plan, that makes sense. This will help you make better decisions of where you allocate your resources and at what speed you should go and all that kind of stuff. So that'd be my end-all catch-all to entrepreneurship starting up.
Thanks, Paul and Vivi, for that great insight. What's important for us to understand is that in our quest to build wealth, we need to avoid several pitfalls or money traps, as they can actually be extremely detrimental to financial growth. While many ideas and concepts may seem appealing as viable options to building wealth, most long-lasting wealth is not built quickly, but rather through a series of intentional planned behaviors that reinforce sound financial strategies. If you're looking to build better financial habits, check out the other episodes at foryourfinancialwellness.com, all part of the Financial Empowerment Charlas, created by Nationwide in partnership with the Hispanic Heritage Foundation. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.